All right, let's dive into some serious stuff today. We're talking U.S. military aid to Ukraine. And I've got an article here from the Kyiv Independent, plus a Reddit discussion from Tree News, both stemming from the same AP report. But, the Reddit thread, well, it adds a whole other layer of public reaction. So we're going to unpack not just what this aid package contains, but what it all means, for the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's like getting the official word and then, bam, the public's raw take on it all, which, let's be honest, can sometimes be even more revealing.
Right. Okay, so first up, the Kyiv Independent breaks down this $1.25 billion aid package. A lot of money, obviously, but what are we really talking about here?
The dollar amount itself isn't really the big story. It's about what that money is actually buying. This package, it's all about bolstering Ukraine's air defenses, which, given Russia's recent tactics, is a huge deal. We're talking munitions for Hawk and NASAMS systems. Think of those as, like, the big guns for taking out missiles and drones. Plus, those highly effective Stinger missiles, the portable ones. And, of course, a whole lot of artillery rounds for ground defense.
So it's not just defensive in a general sense. It's a very specific countermove. And the timing of this is particularly interesting, just days before President-elect Trump takes office. Knowing his, well, let's just say his stance on Russia has sparked a lot of debate.
Exactly. And that's what makes this move by the outgoing administration feel so strategic, almost like shoring up support for Ukraine before the transition happens, like they're trying to box in the incoming administration. Remember, this $1.25 billion comes right after another $500 million in aid announced earlier this month.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if it's a message to Ukraine. Like a we've got your back no matter what kind of thing. Especially with Russia's attacks escalating. I mean, they're getting pretty brutal.
We're not just talking skirmishes on the front lines anymore. Russia has been hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure hard, plunging entire cities into darkness in the middle of winter. It's a calculated move,
Yeah.
which is why this focus on air defense is so vital right now.
Yeah, it's chilling. And that Christmas morning attack on the power grid. Talk about shattering any sense of holiday peace.
A grim wake-up call for sure, and it makes President Biden's promise of a surge in weapons even more urgent. But even with all this aid, the situation on the ground is, well, Ukraine's commander-in-chief called it challenging, and there's a real fear of things spiraling.
Yeah, like walking a tightrope.
Mhm.
Especially with Russia's recent gains in the east, like in the Donetsk Oblast. Now, I know we'll get into public reactions later, but that Reddit thread you sent is buzzing. It's fascinating to see how people are processing
Right.
all this.
It's the range of opinions that's striking. You've got those who are fully on board with supporting Ukraine, no question. Then there are those who are more wary, wondering if it's just throwing resources into a conflict without a clear end. And of course, the ever-present concern about prioritizing our own domestic issues.
Yeah, one comment that really jumped out at me was from a user named Rainbow Joff. They said, Ukraine aid is dead once Trump takes office. It really captures the anxiety some people are feeling.
It cuts right to the heart of a major fear, the uncertainty of what a new administration means for Ukraine. Will the support continue? Will priorities shift? These are valid concerns that need unpacking.
It's not just about political will, though, right? There's the whole debate about America's role in this to begin with. Some argue we're getting into someone else's fight, while others say we have a moral obligation to defend democracy wherever it's threatened.
Exactly. It's messy, it's complex, and there are no easy answers. But that's why these deep dives are so important. It's about going beyond the headlines and really wrestling with those nuances, understanding what's at stake for everyone involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to bring those nuances to life, let's turn to what people are saying in that Reddit thread.
Reading through those Reddit comments, one really stood out to me. It kind of sums up the fear a lot of people are feeling about what happens if the U.S. changes course. One user wrote, if Trump cuts off aid to Ukraine, Russia will just roll right through them. Stark, but it highlights how much is riding on this aid.
That one hit me hard, too. It makes you think, is Ukraine's fate really that fragile? Like completely dependent on U.S. support?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It speaks volumes about the power dynamics on the global stage. But, we have to acknowledge, Ukraine has put up an incredible fight. They've surprised a lot of people with their resilience, holding their own against a much larger force.
Yeah, they've definitely exceeded expectations. But let's be honest, it's Russia they're up against, a country with a long history of using military force to get what it wants. Total David versus Goliath situation.
Exactly. And that's why this U.S. military aid is so critical. It's about leveling the playing field, giving Ukraine the resources to stand a chance. But like you see in that Reddit thread, there's a lot of frustration, too. Some people are saying it's like throwing money into a bottomless pit.
I get that. You can't blame people for questioning if the aid is truly effective,
Yeah.
especially with so many problems here at home. It taps into that whole debate. Should America be the world's police or focus on our own backyard?
Right, and that debate's far from settled. But what we can't lose sight of is the human cost of this conflict. Every single day, Ukrainian civilians are caught in the crossfire. Their homes, their families, their entire lives are being torn apart.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics. But at the end of the day, it's real people who are suffering.
Absolutely, and that's why those long-term implications are so important to discuss.
Hmm?
What happens if the U.S. scales back its support? Will other countries step up? Will Russia see it as a green light to push even harder? We need to be asking these questions.
And what about the impact on U.S. politics? Will this issue continue to divide us? Or can we find some common ground on how to move forward? It feels impossible to predict so much uncertainty.
It is a pivotal moment, not just for Ukraine, but for America's place in the world. Will the new administration be tough on Russia or seek a more diplomatic path? Only time will tell how this all unfolds.
It's like we're at a crossroads, and the path we choose will have consequences for years to come. But for now, let's shift gears a bit. Look at the key Independent article, which really stresses the urgency of bolstering Ukraine's air defenses.
Yeah, it's a race against time. The article mentions that Ukraine formally asked NATO for at least 20 air defense systems, weeks before this aid package was even announced. They're not just asking, they're pleading for help.
And it's clear why. Every day without proper protection means more Ukrainian lives lost. It's not just about stopping missiles. It's about protecting their ability to function as a nation.
Exactly. When you target energy infrastructure, you're not just cutting off electricity, you're crippling hospitals, schools, businesses, the essential fabric of their society.
It's like attacking their spirit, their will to fight back.
Exactly. Psychological warfare woven into the physical conflict. And it puts the incoming administration in a really tough spot. How do you balance the need for a strong response, the desire for diplomacy, and all those domestic concerns we talked about?
Right. And how much will President-elect Trump's past comments about Russia influence his approach? It feels like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens.
It's high stakes for sure. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months will have huge consequences for everyone.
You know, while we're talking about the weight of those decisions, there's one more point from the Reddit thread I wanted to bring up. It's not directly about the aid package, but it speaks to a broader feeling a lot of people are having.
Okay, I'm listening.
There were a bunch of comments expressing this deep anxiety about American democracy. Worries about trust in our institutions fading, the growing divide between us. It felt like this collective sigh of worry.
Well, it's not surprising, given everything that's going on. This conflict is unfolding against a backdrop of global uncertainty. We're still dealing with a pandemic, political divisions are getting worse, and the climate crisis is looming. It's a lot to handle.
It's like this conflict in Ukraine is reflecting those bigger struggles, but on a global scale. The fight for democracy, the push against authoritarianism, the search for stability.
You got it. And it reminds us, the freedoms we often take for granted are constantly under threat. We have to protect them, both here at home and around the world.
Those are some heavy thoughts to carry with us as we wrap up this part of our deep dive. But I think it's important to acknowledge those anxieties, those underlying currents that are shaping how we see this conflict.
I agree. It's not just about Ukraine, it's about the kind of world we want to live in, the values we want to hold on to, the future we want to build. And that brings us to the crucial question of what that future might look like.
So, we're back. And it's time to look ahead, beyond the immediate crisis. This isn't just about Ukraine, is it?
No, not at all. This conflict has the potential to, reshape the whole global landscape. It's like a crack in the foundation, exposing all those tensions that were already there.
Okay, so what are the long-term things we should be watching for? Where could all this lead?
Well, for one thing, it's shown the limits of institutions like the UN. They haven't been able to prevent this conflict or really resolve it, which raises big questions about their role going forward.
And what about deterrence? Like, the threat of sanctions hasn't exactly stopped Russia. So what does that mean for the future? What will it take to actually stop aggression on a global scale?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? If the tools we have now aren't enough to stop a major power like Russia, then we need to rethink our whole approach. It's a serious wake-up call.
And this word keeps coming to mind. Escalation. Is there a real chance this could turn into a wider conflict, maybe even pulling in NATO countries?
It's the worst-case scenario, but we can't ignore it. There's always the risk of miscalculation or things spiraling out of control. And then there's the potential for nuclear weapons to enter the equation.
Okay, deep breaths, I know.
Yeah.
But if those are the risks, what can be done to prevent things from getting worse? Is there a way back from the edge?
Diplomacy, even when it feels impossible, is still the best option. We have to keep talking to Russia, even while condemning their actions. It's a tough balance, for sure.
But how do you negotiate with a country that seems set on using force? Sometimes it feels pointless.
It's incredibly difficult, no question, but cutting off all communication is even riskier. We have to find ways to de-escalate, to build some level of trust. That's the first step towards a solution, even if it's a long way off.
I hear you, but even if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, the problems that started this conflict would still be there. So how do we stop this from happening all over again?
That's the real challenge, the long game. We need to address Russia's security concerns, but without sacrificing Ukraine's independence. It's a complex puzzle, no easy answers.
Okay, maybe this is too idealistic, but shouldn't this be a wake-up call for the whole world? Do we need to rethink global security from the ground up?
Absolutely. This conflict has shown us the flaws in the current system. We need to learn from this, work together to build something more resilient, something that actually prevents these conflicts from happening.
That's a tall order, but it feels necessary. Otherwise, we're just going to keep repeating this cycle of violence and suffering.
You're right, and it's crucial to remember the human cost of all this. Millions of lives have been disrupted, and the impact will be felt for generations.
It's a reminder that peace isn't just the absence of war. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe, secure, and has a chance at a good life.
Well said. And that's something worth striving for, both in Ukraine and everywhere else.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive, but something tells me this conversation isn't over.
It's just the beginning. I hope you'll keep learning, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions. This isn't just about watching events unfold, it's about engaging with them, shaping them, and working towards a better future.
It's about taking what we know and turning it into action. So thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the ideas that shape our world.